When we talk about a seed is an adaptation. It is a genetic adaptation. So what this means is that in the DNA of these plants has evolved a set of code that creates a seed structure and controls the behavior of this seed. So development and germination are really behaviors. And so in the notes before, we should have talked a little bit about phototropism, gravitropism, and thigmotropism, right? Yes? And so those are behaviors, those are responses to light. Seed development and germination are also responses to environmental cues. So the seed is only going to develop after fertilization. So seed development happens after fertilization. Now pollination is just the transfer of the male gamete, which is pollen, to the female stigma, which we'll talk about in just a second. But if we look at the life cycle of seed plants, angiosperms and gymnosperms will start as a seed, will grow into a mature plant, which at some point in its life cycle will signal for reproduction and will start all the way back over at a seed. So this is the plant's life cycle. Seed to shining seed. Okay? So the seed structure has three main parts. They're right here. So I would just try to focus on those three parts. The coat is really for protection. Protection of what? Protection of the embryo. The embryo is 2N. The embryo is the new baby plant. So when the sperm and the egg get together during fertilization, what we have is this new embryo. And for plants, they don't provide like protection in terms of the parent protecting the embryo. Like if you think of a human reproducing, females protect the embryo for 9 months. Plants don't do that. But they do provide some type of protection, also because conditions aren't equally ideal for germination. So germination is the beginning of growth. Most of you would probably be okay defining what germination is. What are some signs that are going to tell us when we should germinate? How does a seed know when it's a good time to germinate? There are going to be some signals. They can send each other signals, if you remember allelopathy, poisoning each other. But do you remember PR and PFR? It was at the beginning of the notes before this. It can either receive red light or shade, which is far red light. So light is going to be a signal.
You said far red light, is it FAR?
Mm-hmm. Like infrared. What else other than light?
Water.
Water. What else? One more real important one.
Sun.
What else comes from the sun other than light? Heat. Temperature. So a seed will know it's the right time to germinate. All seeds don't even germinate at the same time. They have their own cues. So one might have a lot more phytochrome than the other. It might take a lot more light to activate one type of plant than the other. So what you should be able to do is just identify that we have different species that have different adaptations that allow them to have different types of success depending on how they have evolved. And this all comes down to behavior and sensing and the idea of proteins being able to sense environmental cues. So the seed will germinate if there's enough light, water, and temperature. What will actually happen is if there's enough water, then the seed will start to swell and that seed coat will burst. Now some seeds actually require fire to help break down the seed coat, which means that kind of makes sense. If there's a big forest fire, guess what? There's plenty of room to grow. So that's a good time for some seeds to grow. Some seeds are acid resistant. So think about like an apple or a watermelon or an orange, right? You might eat the seed. It would be an advantage if your seed were acid resistant because then the animal helps you disperse. So animals are a big source of dispersal. There are two ways that animals will help. One is by eating fruit. So I just had some strawberries today. They have these tiny little seeds on the outside. Those seeds are acid resistant. When humans used to excrete waste out in the wild, it was perfect for the seed because you ate the strawberries. You didn't release excrement right where you ate the strawberries. You went about your day. A little while later, you made some excrement, and the seed comes out in this nice pile of fertilizer, far away from the parent so it doesn't compete. So the creation of fruit is actually an adaptation that attracts the animal. Now, plants don't want animals to eat their leaves. Why not? We need them for photosynthesis. We don't want you to eat the leaves. So a lot of times leaves will taste very bitter because now we have not genetically engineered, but artificially selected. So guess what? A lot of lettuces, if you have ever eaten like mustard greens or very wild lettuces, they're very bitter. But if you eat like romaine lettuce, we have artificially selected those to not be as bitter. We picked the ones that aren't as bitter, made those breed, and those are the ones that we grow. But plants do want you to eat their fruit. So they'll spend a lot of time and energy making sugars, building a fruit, in hopes that the animal will eat the fruit and help disperse the seeds. We'll also see the idea of like, I'll just call them like sticky seeds. If you've ever gotten, in Wilmington they have what are called like sand spurs. They're little seeds that kind of like stick to your clothing, or if you have a dog, sometimes your dog will come in with like little things stuck to it. That's a seed dispersal adaptation. It gets stuck on the animal, and then the animal pulls them off in a different place. And that is an adaptation to help with seed dispersal. You also want to throw in wind when you blow a dandelion. That's an example of seed dispersal. And water can also help. So a coconut is actually a seed. It's hollow on the inside so that it floats. So when we look at how plants reproduce, there's a variety of different adaptations that help a plant be able to get its genes into the next generation. And so the last part that you need to have some background on is just the structure of an angiosperm. Now gymnosperms, mainly pine trees, they'll do all of this, just not the fruit. So fruits also go with angiosperms. Angiosperms make flowers and they make fruits. If we talk about the flower, there's a lot of complex parts to a flower that you don't need to know. What you do need to know is that there are male parts and there are female parts. The petals are actually not part of the sexual, they're not a gender. They're brightly colored to help attract a pollinator. Keep in mind, a pollinator can be a bee, it can be an ant, it can be a butterfly, it can be a bird, it can be a bat. There are bats that are pollinators. The key thing being that you want to differentiate between leaves and petals. So petals are usually going to be brightly colored. It's really expensive for the plant to make this. And so this is why we have that idea of periodism, of when do you create a flower. Don't create it when all your pollinators are in hibernation. Don't create it when you could get a freeze the next day and all of these cells swell with water, burst, and die. So it's very important that the plant control when this reaction happens. So the petals are going to attract the pollinator. The pollinator is actually going to be attracted to the part of the flower that creates the nectar, but keep in mind it's going to be a really small amount of nectar. You don't want the bee filling up on this flower and going home. The plants benefit the most, right? Make sure you try to use your vocabulary there. The plants benefit the most when the bee has to go from flower to flower. And so what we see is this idea of pollen being picked up. As the pollinator lands, buzzes around looking for every little drop of nectar, and then it goes to the next flower, and the pollen gets transferred from the anther to the stigma. The stigma is sticky, and it'll travel down and get to the ovary where it fertilizes the egg. So the main thing that you should be able to take away is this idea of a sophisticated structure that maximizes your chance of reproduction. And that's really what you need to know about the flower and the idea of periodism. Questions? You would just want to make sure that if you were to talk about this, that you talk about meiosis, making the gametes fusing during fertilization, and then needing to grow into a multicellular organism. That's a big idea of reproduction. So I have a really cute video that my mom actually found